Let me ask you something. What happens when the federal government forces an entire industry to use a piece of technology? The technology doesn't work the way they promised. The people using it start finding workarounds because the rules are strangling them. And then the government turns around and says you are the criminal. That is exactly what is happening in trucking right now. And the crackdown that's coming in May 2026 is going to catch a lot of people off guard. So let's talk about it. Because the Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance, CVSA, just announced that their annual International Road Check Blitz, scheduled for May 12th through the 14th, is going to zero in on one thing above all else: ELD tampering. Not brakes, not tires, not even impaired driving. The number one driver's side focus of the biggest inspection event of the year is going to be whether or not your electronic logging device has been messed with. And if inspectors determine your logs have been tampered with, you're not getting a warning. You're getting put out of service immediately for a minimum of 10 hours, possibly longer. Now here's the context that makes this so much more explosive than it sounds on paper. Starting April 1st, 2026, and yes, the irony of that date is not lost on anyone, ELD tampering officially becomes a standalone out-of-service violation under CVSA's updated criteria. That means inspectors now have a specific code, a specific process, and a specific mandate to hunt for it. This isn't just heightened awareness. This is a formalized enforcement weapon that did not exist before. And the numbers already tell the story. In 2025, falsification of record of duty status was the second most cited driver violation in the entire country. 58,382 violations. During last year's road check alone, false logs ranked as the number 4 overall driver violation. 5 out of the top 10 driver violations were related to hours of service or ELDs. That's not a fringe issue. That is the industry screaming under the weight of a system that does not work for the people actually doing the job. But here's where it gets really interesting, and where the story goes deeper than most people realize. ELD tampering didn't just happen organically. A black market grew up around it. Our Drive reported that companies are cold calling motor carriers and owner-operators offering what they call ELD editing services. One outfit called Logbook Hub was advertising on Facebook that it could fix your logbook for $30 a week. Another company, AVN Logistics Group, called an owner-operator promising services that included e-log editing. When a reporter pressed them on it, they first admitted they could add driving time after a driver ran out of hours. Then backpedaled and said everything they do is perfectly legal. $30 a week to make your violations disappear. That's not a couple of rogue drivers. That's an industry within an industry, and it exists because the underlying system created the demand for it. And while we're on the subject of the underlying system, let's talk about the devices themselves. Because FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, has been on an absolute tear pulling ELDs off the approved list. Just this week on February 12th, 9 more devices got revoked. In late December 2025, 4 more were yanked. In early December, another 3. These are devices that were supposedly certified as compliant, that carriers were required to purchase and use, and that turned out not to even meet minimal federal standards. Some of them were accused of actively facilitating the very tampering the government now wants to prosecute drivers for. Revoked devices were even re-emerging under new brand names, gaming a self-certification system that FMCSA itself admitted was broken. So the agency created a system where manufacturers could certify their own compliance within essentially no verification. Let non-compliant and outright fraudulent devices lead the market, and is now telling the drivers they're criminals for using them. You really cannot make this up. And FMCSA's response? They announced a complete overhaul of the vetting process back in December 2025. But an overhaul years after the mandate went into effect is not a victory lap. It's an admission of institutional failure. The ELD mandate was sold as tamper-proof. That was the whole pitch. No more paper comic books, no more swindle sheets, electronic devices that automatically record driving time and can be altered. Except they absolutely can be altered. And now there is a cottage industry built around doing exactly that. And the government is responding not by fixing the root problem, but by punishing the people at the bottom of the food chain. Now, I want to be fair here, because this issue has legitimate perspectives on both sides. There is a third-generation CDL holder who left a public comment on the FMCSA docket saying that going back to paper logs right now would be a disaster because the industry has not been purged of bad actors yet. And that's a reasonable point. There are carriers out there, and we all know who they are, that would absolutely exploit a return to paper to run drivers into the ground. Fatigue driving kills people. That is not debatable. And some of the ELD tampering that inspectors are catching is genuinely dangerous. Drivers whose fuel receipts show them in Missouri while their logs claim they were off duty in Arizona over 1,000 miles away 3 days later. That's not a guy who needed 20 more minutes to get home. That's systematic fraud that puts everyone on the road at risk. But the other side of this coin is just as real, and frankly, the comments pouring into the FMCSA docket right now tell that story better than I ever could. The Federation of Professional Truckers just filed a formal exemption request asking FMCSA to let drivers go back to paper logs voluntarily. Over 325 comments have let it in, and what those drivers are saying should make regulators uncomfortable. One driver with 29 years of experience said ELDs are the most unsafe device ever forced on trucking. People speeding through parking lots, through construction zones, through congested traffic, blowing past law enforcement on the shoulder, all to save minutes on the clock. Drivers taking their 30-minute breaks on highway shoulders because there is no safe parking and the clock won't stop. People running out of hours 20 minutes from home and being forced to sit for 10 hours in their truck. Another commenter said, the driver shortage spiked when the ELD mandate hit because trucking stopped being a lifestyle and became a prison sentence managed by a screen on your dash. And that's the fundamental tension at the heart of all this. You've got a government that says ELDs are essential for safety. You've got an industry full of professionals who say ELDs actually make the roads less safe because they force rigid compliance with a clock instead of letting drivers use their own judgment about when they're fit to drive. And you've got a black market of tampering services that exists specifically because the gap between the regulation and reality became a canyon that millions of dollars are flowing through. And let me layer one more thing onto this, because the timing matters. All of this is happening in the same regulatory environment where FMCSA just issued a final rule essentially banning non-domiciled CDLs for most non-citizens, where English language proficiency is now being enforced as an immediate out-of-service violation at roadside, where nearly 3,000 CDL training providers were removed from the federal registry and another 4,500 are under investigation, where California got hit with $160 million in withheld federal highway funding for failing to cancel over 17,000 illegally issued commercial driver's licenses. This is not a government that's loosening its grip on trucking. This is an enforcement escalation across every conceivable axis. And ELD tampering is just the latest front. So what does all of this mean for you if you are a driver or an owner-operator watching this? It means May 12th through 14th needs to be circled on your calendar in red. During those 72 hours, inspectors at every weight station and pop-up site across the United States, Canada, and Mexico are going to be running level 1 inspections, the full 37-step procedure, and they are going to be specifically trained and specifically motivated to look for signs of ELD manipulation. They'll be cross-referencing your logs with fuel receipts, with GPS data, with any inconsistency that suggests your records have been altered without the proper edit trail. If they find tampering and they cannot determine when your last rest period actually was, you're sitting for 10 hours minimum. That's not a fine. That's lost revenue, it's a violation on your record, and depending on who are you leased, it could be a career problem. And by the way, cargo securement is the vehicle side focus for RoadCheck 2026. In 2025, over 34,000 violations were issued for improperly secured loads. So it's not just your logs they're after. Your flatbed, your van, your reefer, everything gets scrutinized. But let's zoom out because the real conversation here is not about 1 3-day blitz. It's about whether the ELD mandate as it exists today is actually accomplishing what it was supposed to accomplish, or whether it's created a compliance theater that punishes honest operators while the real bad actors just buy their way around it for $30 a week. FMCSA has an active notice of proposed rulemaking targeted for May 2026 to revise ELD technical specifications. That's an admission that the specs aren't right. They're pulling devices off the approved list every other week. That's an admission that the certification process was not right. Hundreds of drivers are filling public comments begging for the option to go back to paper. That's an admission that the user experience is not right. And yet, the enforcement hammer keeps swinging down. Not on the device manufacturers who sold fraudulent products, not on the dispatchers and carriers who pressure drivers to run illegal hours, not on the brokers who set delivery windows that are physically impossible to meet legally. It swings down on the driver sitting in the cab. The question isn't whether ELD tampering should be ignored. Obviously, it should not. Fatigue driving is deadly. But the question is whether the right answer is a bigger hammer or a better system. Because right now, we're getting the hammer. And the people building a better system are working on a timeline that's years behind the enforcement curve. If you're running clean, if your ELD is on the approved list, if your logs are accurate and your edits are documented, you've got nothing to worry about. But if you're one of the thousands of drivers and carriers who've been cutting corners whether out of desperation or greed, May 2026 is going to be a wake-up call. And for the rest of us, it's worth asking, when does cracking down on symptoms become an excuse for never fixing the disease? That's where we are. And that's what nobody in charge seems willing to say out loud. If this hits home, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe if you want to stay ahead of what's coming next. Because this industry is changing fast. And the people who are not paying attention are the ones who get left behind. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.